warehouse reeked of rotting grain and fear. Emma pressed her 12-year-old frame against the splintered wooden wall, her arm wrapped protectively around 8-year-old Tommy's trembling shoulders. Through the gaps between the boards, she could see the hunting dogs, massive bloodhounds straining against their leashes, their baying echoing off the canyon walls like the howls of demons. "I can smell them, Hayes." Jack Morrison's voice carried across the yard, rough with excitement. "They're in there somewhere." Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched Director Cornelius Hayes dismount from his black stallion. Even at this distance, she could see the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes as he surveyed the burning remains of the farmhouse they'd escaped from barely an hour ago. The Hendersons had tried to help them, and now their bodies lay cooling in the ashes of their home. "Burn it." Hayes commanded his cultured voice, carrying the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to absolute power. "Smoke them out like the vermin they are." Tommy's fingers dug into Emma's arm as the first torch sailed through the warehouse doorway. Within seconds, flames began licking at the hay bales stacked near the entrance. The acrid smoke made Emma's eyes water, but it was the memory that nearly broke her the last time she'd seen her mother 5 years ago, reading to her from a worn book of fairy tales. Once upon a time, Caroline Whitlock had whispered her gentle voice, weaving magic in the darkness of their tiny cabin. There was a little girl who had to be very brave. The memory dissolved as another torch crashed through the warehouse roof, showering them with sparks. They had maybe 3 minutes before the smoke became lethal, maybe 5 before the entire structure collapsed in flames. That's when she saw him. Through the wavering heat and smoke, a figure materialized on the ridge above the warehouse, motionless as carved stone wrapped in buffalo hide, his face painted with streaks of red and black war paint. In his left hand, he gripped something that made Emma's stomach lurch, a fresh scalp, the pale hair still dripping blood. Chief McCoons. The name whispered through mining camps and frontier towns like a curse always spoken in hushed tones and accompanied by nervous glances over shoulders. The Lakota warrior who'd been hunting white men across 3 territories, taking revenge for crimes that went deeper than mere theft or murder. But he wasn't looking at Hayes and his men. His dark eyes were fixed directly on Emma and Tommy, studying them with the intensity of a mountain cat sizing up prey. For a moment that stretched like eternity, predator and quarry regarded each other across the smoke-filled air. Then Hayes spotted him. Jesus Christ. The director's voice cracked like thin ice. "Indian on the ridge. Take him down." Rifles barked and echoed off the canyon walls, but when the gun smoke cleared them, the ridge was empty. Chief McCoons had vanished like morning mist, leaving only the taste of gunpowder and the terrible certainty that their lives had just changed forever. Emma pulled Tommy deeper into the warehouse as flames began eating through the support beams above their heads. Whatever game was being played here, they were caught in the middle of it. 2 runaway orphans trapped between a child trafficker who wanted them dead and a Lakota warrior whose intentions remained as mysterious as the paint on his weathered face. But as the warehouse began its death throes around them, Emma made a desperate choice. She grabbed Tommy's hand and ran not toward the front entrance, where Hayes waited with his guns and dogs, but toward the rear wall, where the flames hadn't yet reached. The boards were old and dry, weakened by years of weather. Emma threw her slight weight against them until one plank splintered, then another. Tommy squeezed through the gap first, his smaller frame allowing him to escape easily. Emma followed, feeling splinters tear at her dress as she pushed through the opening. They emerged into the crisp Montana dawn, to find Chief McCoons waiting for them mounted on a paint horse that stood perfectly still, despite the chaos around it. The warrior's rifle was trained on the warehouse entrance, ready for Hayes's men, if they followed too quickly. "You will come," he said in accented English, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Or you will die." Behind them, the warehouse roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and flaming timber. Hayes's shouts of rage echoed across the canyon as he realized his quarry had escaped once again. But Emma was already moving, pulling Tommy toward the warrior's horse with the desperate speed of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant trusting the devil you didn't know over the one you did. As McCoons pulled them up behind him, Emma caught a glimpse of something that made her breath catch: a silver locket hanging from a leather cord around the warrior's neck, its surface engraved with tiny flowers, exactly like the ones her mother used to draw in the margins of her school papers. The paint horse leaped forward like a bolt of lightning, carrying them away from the burning warehouse and into a wilderness where the rules of civilization no longer applied. Behind them, Hayes' voice rose in fury, promising rewards for their capture and death for anyone who helped them. But ahead lay only questions. Why had a Lakota warrior saved 2 white children? What connection did he have to their past? And most importantly, how long could they survive in a world where everyone wanted them dead? The horses' hooves drummed against hard-packed earth as they raced toward an uncertain future, leaving behind nothing but smoke and ashes, and the echo of a mother's voice reading fairy tales in the darkness. Emma held tight to Tommy and tried not to think about whether their story would have a happy ending or an ending at all. Riverside Orphanage had been their prison for 3 years, its gray stone walls rising from the prairie like a fortress built to contain despair rather than protect innocence. Emma had learned the truth about Director Hayes 6 months ago when she discovered the ledger hidden in his office pages of transactions, where children's names were matched with prices, buyers listed as mining companies and agricultural concerns. What Hayes called adoption, Emma knew was slavery. The escape had cost them everything they'd ever cared about. Sarah Chen, only 10 years old, had volunteered to create a distraction by setting fire to the kitchen while Emma and Tommy slipped away through a loose board in the cellar wall. Emma still heard Sarah's screams sometimes when the wind was right, and memory played cruel tricks on her mind. Tommy had watched Hayes personally drag their friend to the punishment cells, and that was the day his voice died. He'd spoken barely a dozen words since then, communicating only through gestures and the haunted look in his blue eyes. Now, 3 months later, they'd survived by becoming ghosts. Emma had learned to pick locks by watching the older boys practice on rusted padlocks, and she could move through shadows like her life depended on it, because it did. Tommy, despite his silence, had developed an uncanny ability to sense danger before it arrived, his small hand finding Emma's shoulder seconds before trouble appeared. The painted warrior had first shown himself 2 weeks after their escape from Riverside. Emma would catch glimpses of him on distant ridges, always watching but never approaching. The miners called him Chief McCoons, a name that meant bear cub in the old tongue, though there was nothing playful about the man who bore it. They said he'd lost his entire family to a cavalry raid 3 years ago, and that he'd sworn blood vengeance against every white man who profited from Indian suffering. But McCoons had never attacked them, never threatened them. He just watched patient as the mountains themselves until circumstances forced his hand. Now, riding through the pre-dawn darkness toward an unknown destination, Emma studied the warrior's broad back and wondered what twist of fate had brought them together. The silver locket at his throat caught the moonlight, and she found herself thinking of her mother's gentle hands of bedtime stories and lullabies that seemed like fragments of a dream. They rode for 2 hours through terrain so rugged that even experienced trackers would have trouble following their trail. McCoons guided the paint horse with unconscious skill, following game paths through canyons and across windswept mesas, where the only sounds were the whisper of wind through stone and the steady drum of hoofbeats. Finally, as the sun began painting the eastern sky with shades of gold and rose, they descended into a hidden valley where a traditional teepee stood beside a small stream. Smoke drifted from the top, carrying the smell of burning sage. And something else, something that made Emma's stomach clench with desperate hunger. Real food, not the potato peels and stale bread crusts they'd been surviving on for weeks. McCoons dismounted with fluid grace and lifted Tommy down from the horse's back. The boy immediately moved to Emma's side, pressing close to her as they studied their unlikely savior. In the growing daylight, Emma could see that the warrior was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, with silver threading through his black hair and deep lines carved around his dark eyes. "You are hungry," he observed, studying their gaunt faces with something that might have been compassion. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. It had been 2 days since their last real meal, and Tommy was starting to show the telltale signs of serious malnutrition in the hollow cheeks, the way his clothes hung loose on his small frame. "Then we eat," McCoon said simply. "Then we talk about your mother." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. Her mother had died 5 years ago or so, she'd always been told. But the way McCoon spoke suggested knowledge that went deeper than casual acquaintance. Inside the teepee, warmth enveloped them like an embrace. A small fire burned in the center, tended by an elderly Lakota woman who looked up as they entered. Her face was weathered by decades of prairie wind and sun, but her eyes held the same keen intelligence Emma had seen in McCoon's gaze. "Grandmother Yellowbird," McCoon said in English, clearly for Emma and Tommy's benefit. "These are Caroline's children." The old woman's face transformed, grief and joy warring across her features as she studied Emma and Tommy with growing intensity. When she spoke, her English was careful but clear. "You have her eyes," she said to Emma. "And her stubborn chin. She gestured toward Tommy, has the look of his father." "Our father is dead," Emma said automatically, the words she'd been taught to recite whenever the subject arose. "No," Yellowbird replied gently. "Your father lives. He searches for you even now." The teepee seemed to spin around Emma as she struggled to process what she was hearing. Everything she'd been told about her origins was a lie. Her parents weren't dead. Her family wasn't lost. Somewhere out there, a father she'd never known was looking for children he'd thought were gone forever. "I don't understand," she whispered. McCoon settled himself beside the fire, his movements careful and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief and carefully nursed anger. "Your mother was schoolteacher in Billings. Good woman, helped everyone, white Indian, mixed blood, made no difference to her. She discovered Hayes was selling children to mine owners' work farms. Tried to gather evidence, expose his crimes." "What happened to her?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible. It was the first time Emma had heard him speak in weeks. "Hayes had her killed," McCoons replied bluntly. "Shot while she protected other children. But before she died, she hid you both with white family in Miles City, told them to change your names, keep you safe." Emma's hands shook as she absorbed the implications. Her mother hadn't abandoned them, she died protecting them. And Hayes, the monster who'd made their lives hell at Riverside, was the same man who'd murdered their mother and stolen their childhood. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked. "Because your father asked me to find you," McCoons replied. "Because Caroline saved my life once, and I owed her debt. Because Hayes must pay for what he has done." Yellowbird ladled stew into wooden bowls, the rich smell of venison and vegetables making Emma's mouth water. As they ate their first real meal in days, she found herself studying McCoon's weathered face, looking for answers to questions she wasn't sure how to ask. "Our father," she said finally. "What's his name?" "William Crow Feather," McCoons replied. "Deputy Marshal for Territorial Court, also War Chief of Oglala Band. Your blood is mixed half white from your mother, half Lakota from him." The revelation should have shocked Emma, but somehow it felt right, like a missing piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place. It explained the way other children at Riverside had sometimes looked at her and Tommy, the subtle differences that had set them apart even among society's unwanted. "That's why Hayes wants us dead," she realized. "Not just because we escaped, but because of what we represent. Our mixed blood makes some people crazy with hate," Yellowbird confirmed sadly. "They fear what they do not understand." Outside the teepee, Emma could hear the paint horse nickering softly, probably scenting water from the nearby stream. The sound was peaceful, Normal, a sharp contrast to the violence and terror that had defined their lives for the past 3 months. But even as she began to relax for the first time since their escape, Emma knew this respite was temporary. Hayes wouldn't give up easily, and he had resources they couldn't match moneymen legal authority that would make their word worthless against his. "What happens now?" she asked McCoons. The warrior's expression hardened with determination. "Now we finish what your mother started. Every child Hayes has sold, every buyer who profited from their suffering, all will face justice." "How many children?" Tommy asked quietly. "Too many," McCoons replied. "But with help we can save those who still live." As they settled down to sleep on buffalo robes arranged around the dying fire, Emma found herself thinking about the father she'd never known. William Crowfeather, deputy marshal and war chief, a man who'd somehow managed to bridge two worlds that usually existed in mortal conflict. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. Hayes would be hunting them with renewed fury, and the winter weather was getting worse with each passing day. But for the first time in months, Emma felt something that had been missing from her life for too long. Hope. The sound that woke Emma 3 hours later wasn't the gentle nickering of horses or the whisper of wind through the teepee walls. It was the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed immediately by Yellowbird's urgent voice. "Riders coming, many guns." Emma was on her feet instantly, Tommy beside her, as they peered through the teepee entrance. In the distance, she could see a line of horsemen cresting the ridge, at least 8 men moving with the purposeful advance of a military patrol. But these weren't soldiers. Emma recognized the black stallion in the lead and the pale-eyed man who rode it with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Hayes had found them. McCoons was already moving, gathering weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. "Back entrance," he said curtly. "Yellowbird knows way through canyon. Move fast, stay quiet." But as they prepared to flee once again, Emma caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. One of Hayes's riders was carrying a bundle across his saddle, something small and still wrapped in what looked like a torn dress. "Sarah," Tommy whispered, following her gaze. Emma's heart broke as she realized what they were seeing. Hayes had brought their friend's body as proof of what happened to children who tried to escape his system. It was a message as clear as any words: surrender now or suffer the same fate. "She's dead because of us," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "She's dead because of Hayes," McCoons corrected firmly. "Do not carry his guilt. Your friend chose to help you honor that choice by staying alive." The warrior's words were harsh but true. Sarah had known the risks. When she created that distraction, had accepted them willingly because she believed some things were worth dying for. Emma couldn't let that sacrifice be meaningless. As they slipped out through the canyon's hidden passages, leaving behind the warmth and safety of the teepee, Emma made a silent promise to her murdered friend. She would survive, she would find their father, and she would make Hayes pay for every child he'd killed. Behind them, the sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls as Hayes discovered their empty refuge. But ahead lay only wilderness and uncertainty, and the growing understanding that their war against the forces of greed and hatred had only just begun. The narrow canyon trail wound upward through terrain so treacherous that a single misstep could send them tumbling hundreds of feet to the rocks below. Emma followed Yellowbird's sure-footed progress, trying not to look down as they climbed higher into the mountains. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but never disappeared entirely. Hayes's men were following their trail with the persistence of hunting wolves. Tommy was struggling. His 8-year-old legs weren't built for this kind of sustained climbing, and the thin air at altitude made every breath a conscious effort. Emma could see him starting to flag his steps, becoming unsteady as exhaustion took hold. "Rest," McCoons commanded. Though Emma could tell, the stop went against his every instinct. The warrior had been checking their back trail constantly, his weathered face growing more concerned with each passing hour. They sheltered in a cave, barely large enough for 4 people, its entrance hidden behind a screen of frost-covered pine boughs. Yellowbird produced strips of dried meat from her pack, but Emma noticed the old woman taking only a small portion for herself, ensuring the children ate first, even as their supplies dwindled. "How much farther?" Emma asked, trying to keep the desperation out of her voice. 2 hours to winter camp," Yellowbird replied. "Safe place hidden from white eyes for many generations." "Will Father be there?" Tommy asked quietly. "William searches in other direction." McCoons explained. "Thinks Hayes took you toward railroad. We must reach safe place, then send word." Emma felt a stab of disappointment followed immediately by worry. If their father was looking in the wrong area, he might walk straight into one of Hayes's traps. The director was cunning enough to use their father's search as bait for an ambush. "Hayes knows about him?" she asked. McCoon's expression darkened. "Hayes knows many things. Has spies, informants, corrupt officials who tell him government business. Your father is careful but not invisible." The implications were terrifying. Not only were she and Tommy being hunted, but their father, a man they'd never met, was also walking into danger because of them. A distant sound made McCoons freeze, his head tilted as he listened to something the others couldn't hear. After a moment, his face relaxed slightly. "Horses," he said. "But not Hayes's men. Different riders moving fast." Yellowbird peered out through the cave entrance, her old eyes still sharp enough to pick out details at a distance. When she turned back to them, her face was bright with hope. "The Lakota warriors," she announced. "Young men from our band riding hard. They must have received word about the children." Emma's heart leapt with hope, but McCoons looked troubled rather than relieved. "It's too soon," he muttered. "Unless—" His face went pale with understanding. Trap. Hayes must have captured messenger, forced him to send false word. The realization hit Emma like a physical blow. Hayes was using their own people against them, turning their hope for rescue into another weapon in his arsenal. The riders approaching might be genuine Lakota warriors, or they might be Hayes' men disguised to get close enough for an ambush. "What do we do?" she asked. "Now we wait," McCoons replied grimly, "and we prepare for either possibility." The warrior began checking his weapons with methodical precision rifle pistol and 2 wickedly curved knives that looked like they'd seen considerable use. Yellowbird produced her own weapon, a small but deadly-looking tomahawk that had clearly been maintained with loving care. Emma felt helpless watching the adults prepare for battle. She had no weapons except a small knife McCoons had given her for cutting rope, and no training in how to fight armed men. If this turned into violence, her job would be to protect Tommy and stay out of the way. The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by voices calling out in the Lakota language. Yellowbird's expression grew more hopeful as she listened, but McCoons remained skeptical. "Our words are right," the old woman reported. "They ask for Chief McCoons, say they bring greetings from William Crow Feather." "Words can be learned," McCoons replied. "Hayes has Indian scoutsmen who would sell their own mothers for white gold." A new voice called out from below, this one speaking English, with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom it wasn't a native language. "Brother McCoons, I am Standing Bear, son of Chief Red Cloud. I bring word from the federal marshal." McCoon's face showed the first crack in his stoic composure. "Standing Bear is nephew," he admitted. "Good man, brave warrior. But Hayes could have captured him too," Emma finished. The warrior nodded grimly. They were caught between desperate hope and reasonable paranoia, with no way to verify the truth without exposing themselves to potential danger. It was Tommy who provided the solution. The 8-year-old boy had been listening to the voices below with the intense concentration he brought to everything that might affect their safety. "The horses," he said quietly. "They sound wrong." Emma strained to hear what her brother had noticed. To her, the hoofbeats sounded normal, the steady rhythm of horses at rest, stamping and snorting, as they waited for their rider's commands. "Iron shoes," Tommy explained. "Indian ponies don't have iron shoes. Too loud, too heavy for hunting." Macoon's eyes widened with understanding and approval. The boy was right. Traditional Lakota horses went unshod, their hooves left natural for better traction on rough terrain and quieter movement during raids. Only horses used by the cavalry or civilian contractors wore iron shoes. "Smart boy," the warrior murmured, then called down to the riders below. But instead of responding in English, he spoke rapidly in Lakota, his words carrying the rhythm and cadence of formal challenge. The response came back immediately, but it was wrong. Emma could hear the difference, even without understanding the language. The speaker below was using the right words, but with the wrong inflection, like an actor reciting lines without understanding their meaning. "A Hayes's men," Macoons confirmed quietly, using captured Indian to speak words they learned. "We go now before they find cave." They gathered their meager supplies in silence, moving with the careful efficiency of people whose lives depended on leaving no trace behind. Yellowbird led them deeper into the cave system, following passages so narrow they had to crawl single file through sections barely wide enough for an adult body. Behind them, the false Lakota voices continued calling, their tone becoming more urgent as they received no response. Soon those calls would turn to action, and Hayes's men would begin a systematic search of every hiding place in the area. The cave system opened onto a ledge high above the valley floor, offering a clear view of the riders below. Emma counted 9 men, all wearing combinations of cavalry uniforms and civilian clothes that marked them as hired mercenaries rather than legitimate soldiers. At their head rode a figure she recognized despite the Indian clothing he wore. Dutch Anders, the former Riverside guard who'd always seemed uncomfortable with Hayes's methods. "Dutch," she whispered, feeling the bitter taste of betrayal. "You know him?" Macoons asked. "He worked at the orphanage. Sometimes he was kind to us, snuck us extra food when Hayes wasn't watching." Emma's voice was flat with disappointment. "I thought he was different. Fear makes people do terrible things," Yellowbird observed sadly. "Hayes probably threatens his family." Emma wanted to feel sympathy for Dutch, but all she could manage was a cold anger that seemed to be growing stronger with each betrayal they discovered. First, Hayes's systematic corruption of the adoption system, then the murder of the Henderson family, now the corruption of someone she'd thought was an ally. "How many more?" she asked Macoons. "How many people are helping Hayes because they're afraid?" "Too many," the warrior replied. "But also many who would help us if they knew truth. Your father has allies, federal marshals, tribal leaders, honest judges who cannot be bought. Then why haven't they stopped Hayes already? Because Hayes is careful smart. He keeps evidence hidden, witnesses scared or dead. Until now, no one could prove his crimes." "What's different now?" Tommy asked. Macoons looked at Emma and her brother with something that might have been pride. "Now we have children who escaped his system. Living witnesses who can testify to what they saw." The weight of that responsibility settled on Emma's shoulders like a physical burden. She and Tommy weren't just refugees trying to survive. They were key evidence in a case that could save dozens of other children. Their testimony could destroy Hayes's entire network, but only if they lived long enough to give it. Below them, Dutch and his men had given up their deception and were beginning a methodical search of the canyon. They moved with military precision, checking every cave, every hiding place, every spot where fugitives might take shelter. "We need to move," Macoons decided. "Winter camp is still an hour away, but better than being trapped here." As they prepared to leave the ledge, Emma caught sight of something that made her heart race with sudden hope. A new group of riders was approaching from the east, but these moved differently from Dutch's mercenaries. They rode with the fluid grace of born horsemen, their ponies unshod and silent as shadows. Real Lakota warriors. Yellowbird confirmed, her voice bright with relief. At their head rode a figure that made Emma's breath catch, a tall man, wearing both the badge of a federal marshal and the war paint of a Lakota chief. Even at this distance, she could see the family resemblance in his bearing, the way he sat his horse with unconscious authority. "Father," Tommy whispered. William Crow Feather had found them at last. The battle for the canyon began without warning or ceremony. One moment, Dutch and his men were methodically searching cave entrances, and the next, they were fighting for their lives as Lakota warriors materialized from the landscape like avenging spirits. Emma watched from the ledge as her father led the charge, his war cry echoing off the canyon walls as he drove his horse straight at Dutch's position. The former orphanage guard tried to bring his rifle to bear, but William was already inside his guard tomahawk, flashing as he struck with lethal precision. The fight was brief but savage. Hayes's mercenaries were outnumbered and caught by surprise, facing warriors who'd spent generations perfecting the art of mountain warfare. Within minutes, it was over, Dutch, and two of his men lay motionless on the canyon floor, while the survivors had thrown down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. "Come," McCoon said, beginning the careful descent toward the valley floor. "Time to meet your father." Emma's legs felt weak as they made their way down the rocky path. After 5 years of believing her parents were dead, after months of running and hiding and fighting just to stay alive, she was about to come face to face with the man who'd helped give her life. William Crow Feather looked up as they approached, his dark eyes finding Emma's face with laser intensity. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, father and daughter studied each other across the space of years and loss and desperate hope. Then William's weathered face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance, and Emma saw herself reflected in his eyes, the same stubborn jaw, the same fierce intelligence, the same refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. "My daughter," he said simply, and the two words carried the weight of 5 years of grief and love and desperate searching. Emma ran to him, then her 12-year-old composure finally cracking as she threw herself into her father's arms. He caught her easily, his strength evident even as his hands shook with emotion. Behind her, she heard Tommy's footsteps as her brother approached more cautiously, still processing the reality of family after years of believing they were alone in the world. "I thought you were dead," Emma whispered against her father's chest. "I thought I'd lost you both forever," William replied, his voice rough with suppressed tears. "When Hayes took you from the missionary family, when you disappeared into his system, I've been searching ever since." "We escaped," Tommy said quietly, finally close enough to touch. "Emma saved us." William looked down at his son with obvious pride. "Your mother would be proud of both of you. You have her courage, her refusal to accept injustice." "Tell us about her," Emma said. "Please, all we have are fragments, pieces of memory that might not even be real." William's expression grew distant with remembrance. "Caroline was the bravest person I ever knew. Not brave like a warrior in battle, but brave like someone who sees suffering and refuses to look away. She risked everything to expose Hayes's crimes, knowing it would probably cost her life." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside were items Emma recognized with a shock of recognition: her mother's silver locket, a lock of dark hair tied with blue ribbon, and a photograph so small she had to squint to make out the details. The photograph showed a young couple standing together, both serious but clearly happy. The woman was unmistakably Caroline, but the man beside her wore the mixture of federal marshal's badge and traditional Lakota clothing that marked him as someone who moved between two worlds. "We had to keep our marriage secret," William explained. Mixed marriages weren't just illegal, they were considered abominations by both sides. But your mother didn't care about the law, and I didn't care about tradition. We found something worth fighting for. Emma studied the photograph, memorizing every detail of her mother's face. Caroline looked so young, so hopeful, nothing like the bitter, broken woman Emma had sometimes imagined when her memories grew dark. She hit us to keep us safe, she realized. She died to keep you safe. William corrected gently. Hayes discovered she was gathering evidence against his network. He sent men to kill her and destroy her testimony, but she'd already moved you to safety with forged documents and new identities. Why didn't you come for us then? Tommy asked, his voice carrying no accusation, only curiosity. Because your mother made me promise to let you grow up as white children protected from the hatred that follows mixed blood. William replied. She thought it was the only way you'd have normal lives. Emma looked around at the aftermath of the battle, dead mercenaries, wounded warriors, the constant threat of violence that seemed to follow them everywhere they went. Normal life seemed like a fairy tale, something that existed only in the stories her mother used to read. Hayes will never stop hunting us, she said. Not as long as we can testify against him. Then we make sure he can't hunt anyone ever again. William replied, his voice carrying the cold finality of a man who'd made an irrevocable decision. Macoons approached their reunion, moving stiffly from injuries Emma hadn't noticed during the battle. Hayes has more men coming, he reported. Our scouts count 20 riders, maybe hour behind Dutch's group. Where? William asked, instantly shifting into his role as a federal marshal coordinating a tactical response. Following main trail from Billings. They will reach canyon mouth soon. Emma felt her heart sink. Just when she'd found her father, just when it seemed like they might actually have a chance at survival, Hayes was bringing overwhelming force to bear against them. We can't fight 20 men in open ground. William said, his tactical assessment brutally honest. No, Macoons agreed. But we know these mountains can lead Hayes into trap-use terrain against him. What kind of trap? Emma asked. The two men looked at each other, some wordless communication passing between them. When Macoon spoke, his voice carried grim satisfaction. Old silver mine 3 miles north. Tunnels go deep many passages. Good place to make stand, if you do not mind bringing down mountain on your enemies. Emma understood immediately. They were talking about using dynamite to collapse the mine tunnels, trapping Hayes and his men underground while they escaped through hidden passages. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be their only chance to end the hunt once and for all. Too risky, William said immediately. I won't put my children in that kind of danger. We're already in danger, Emma pointed out. At least this way we're fighting back instead of just running. Her father looked like he wanted to argue, but Emma could see the grudging respect in his eyes. She wasn't the helpless child he'd lost 5 years ago. She was a survivor who'd learned to make hard choices under impossible circumstances. If we do this, he said finally, we do it right. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We get Hayes and his men underground, we set the charges, and we get out. What about the other children? Tommy asked quietly. The ones still trapped in Hayes' system. Emma had been wondering the same thing. Destroying Hayes would cripple his network, but it wouldn't automatically free the children he'd already sold to mining companies and work farms across 3 territories. We have his records now, William said, gesturing toward captured documents from Dutch's saddlebags. Names, locations, transaction records. Once Hayes is dead, we can round up his buyers and free every child still in the system. It wasn't perfect. Some children had probably already died in the mines worked to death by men who saw them as disposable tools rather than human beings. But it was justice, and it was hope for those who could still be saved. As they prepared to leave the canyon and make their final stand, Emma looked back at the battlefield where she'd first met her father. Dutch's body lay motionless near the cave entrance, his face peaceful in death despite the violence that had claimed him. She felt no satisfaction in his death, only a weary sadness for all the choices that had led them to this moment. Tomorrow, if they survived, there would be time for grief and healing. But today, there was only the grim necessity of finishing what her mother had started. The trap they set for Hayes was elegant in its simplicity. The abandoned silver mine had 3 entrances, a main shaft, large enough for horses, and 2 smaller passages that connected to the main tunnel system deep underground. McCoons and his warriors positioned themselves at the smaller entrances, ready to drive Hayes's men toward the main shaft, where William and a handful of federal marshals waited with enough dynamite to bring down half the mountain. Emma and Tommy were supposed to wait in safety at a distance, hidden in a grove of pine trees, where they could observe the battle without being caught in the crossfire. But as Hayes and his men approached the mine, Emma realized something that made her blood run cold. The director wasn't just bringing hired guns, he was bringing children. Through the spyglass William had given her, she could see at least 6 young prisoners tied to horses at the rear of Hayes's column. They looked to be between 8 and 12 years old, their faces pale with terror and exhaustion. Hayes was using them as human shields, knowing that no decent person would risk harming children to get to him. "Father," Emma called softly, gesturing for William to join her observation post. When William saw what his daughter had spotted, his face went ashen. The tactical situation had just become infinitely more complicated. They couldn't use the dynamite trap without risking the lives of innocent children. "McCoons needs to know," William said grimly, pulling out a small mirror to signal their Lakota allies. The heliograph flashes conveyed the essential information in seconds. "Enemy has child hostages. Abort. Explosive plan. Prepare for close combat." The response came back immediately. "Understood, will adapt." But Emma could see the problem with any adaptation. Hayes's force of 20 armed men vastly outnumbered their own group of 8 warriors and 3 federal marshals. Without the advantage of the mine trap, they were facing a conventional battle they couldn't win. "There has to be another way," she said, studying the approaching column through the spyglass. "We could try to negotiate," William suggested without much hope. "Offer to trade ourselves for the children." "Hayes doesn't negotiate," Emma replied flatly. "He kills anyone who threatens his operation. Those children are already dead. He's just using them to get close enough to finish us." Tommy had been listening to their conversation with the intense concentration he brought to every survival situation. Now he spoke up, his 8-year-old voice carrying surprising authority. "The mine has more than 3 entrances," he said quietly. Emma and William both looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Emma asked. "When we were running from the orphanage, we hid in lots of old mines. They all have ventilation shafts, emergency exits, places where the miners could escape if the main tunnels collapsed." Emma felt a spark of hope. "You think this mine has hidden exits?" "All mines do," Tommy confirmed. "Usually on the high ground, hidden in rock formations where they won't be noticed." William's expression shifted from despair to calculation. "If we could get the children out through a hidden exit while Hayes is focused on the main entrances, it could work," Emma agreed. "But someone would have to get inside the mine first to find the children and guide them out." "Too dangerous," William said immediately. "I won't risk—" "You won't risk me," Emma interrupted. "But I'm the only one small enough to fit through a ventilation shaft, and the only one those children might trust enough to follow." She could see her father warring with himself, his protective instincts battling against the harsh logic of their situation. But before he could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the mine entrance. Hayes had arrived, and the battle was beginning, whether they were ready or not. "Go," William said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "Find those children and get them to safety. I'll buy you time." Emma squeezed her father's hand, once then turned and ran toward the high ground above the mine. Behind her, the sounds of battle grew more intense, rifle shots echoing off canyon walls, men shouting orders, horses screaming in pain and terror. She found the ventilation shaft exactly where Tommy had predicted. It would be a narrow opening in the rock face, barely wide enough for a child to squeeze through. The shaft angled downward into darkness, its walls slick with condensation and decades of accumulated grime. Emma took a deep breath and pushed herself into the opening. The shaft was even narrower Then it had appeared from outside, forcing her to wriggle forward on her belly like a snake. The darkness was absolute, broken only by faint traces of light that might have been reflections or might have been her imagination. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the shaft opened into a larger tunnel that ran parallel to the main mine workings. Emma could hear voices echoing from somewhere ahead, Hayes's men positioning themselves for the battle above. But she could also hear something else, the sound of children crying. Following the sound through a maze of abandoned tunnels, Emma finally found them in a natural cavern that had been converted into a holding area. 6 children ranging in age from maybe 7 to 13, all bound hand and foot and left in the darkness, while their captors fought for their lives above. "Don't be scared," Emma whispered as she approached the group. "I'm here to help you escape." The oldest of the children, a girl with dark hair and intelligent eyes, looked up at Emma with desperate hope. "Are you one of us from the orphanages?" "I was," Emma replied, pulling out her knife to cut their bonds. "But I got away, and now I'm going to help you get away too." As she freed each child, Emma quickly explained the situation. They were caught in the middle of a battle between Hayes and federal marshals. But there was a way out if they could reach the ventilation shaft she'd used to enter the mine. "Can you all climb?" she asked, studying their faces in the dim light that filtered down from above. Most of them nodded, though the youngest, a boy who couldn't have been older than 6, looked terrified at the prospect. Emma made a quick decision that would complicate their escape, but was the only morally acceptable choice. "I'll carry him," she told the others. "But you'll have to help me take turns supporting his weight when the climb gets too difficult." The journey back through the mine tunnels was a nightmare of darkness and fear. The sounds of battle grew closer as they moved, suggesting that Hayes's men were being driven deeper into the mine by William and McCoon's coordinated assault. They were halfway to the ventilation shaft when disaster struck. A section of tunnel ceiling weakened by decades of water damage, and the vibrations from the gunfight above chose that moment to collapse. Emma threw herself over the youngest children as rocks and timber crashed down around them. When the dust settled, she realized with horror that they were trapped and the tunnel behind them was completely blocked, cutting off their escape route. "What do we do now?" the oldest girl asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Emma looked around desperately, trying to remember the layout of tunnels they'd passed through. There had to be another way out. Miners always built redundant escape routes in case of cave-ins or flooding. This way, she decided, leading them deeper into the mine system. There should be another shaft somewhere ahead. But as they moved through the darkness, Emma began to realize the terrible truth. They weren't lost in an abandoned mine. They were lost in an active battlefield with Hayes's men retreating through these same tunnels as William's forces pressed their attack. The sound of voices ahead confirmed her worst fears. Hayes's men were falling back toward their position, probably planning to make a stand in the cavern where the children had been held. If Emma and her charges kept moving forward, they'd walk straight into a gunfight. But behind them lay only collapsed tunnels and certain death by suffocation or starvation. They were trapped between advancing enemies and impassable obstacles, with 6 terrified children depending on her to find a solution. Emma closed her eyes and tried to think like her mother would have, calm, logical, refusing to accept that any situation was hopeless. There had to be another option, something she was missing in her panic and desperation. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost missed it in the echoing noise of the battle above. Water. Running water moving fast enough to suggest a current rather than just drainage from the surface. "Underground stream," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The mine follows a natural cave system. If we can find the water, we can follow it out of the mountain." The oldest girl, who'd introduced herself as Mary during their escape, caught on immediately. "Like Tom Sawyer," she said, following the stream out of the cave. Emma nodded, grateful for a companion who understood literary references. It meant Mary had been educated before Hayes got his hands on her, which suggested intelligence and resourcefulness that might prove crucial in the next few hours. Following the sound of water led them off the main tunnel system and into natural cave formations that predated the mine by thousands of years. The going was treacherous, wet rocks, sudden drop-offs, passages so narrow they had to crawl single file through spaces barely wide enough for a child's body. But gradually, the sound of gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. Emma's heart raced with hope as she realized they might actually escape this nightmare alive. They emerged from the cave system through a hidden entrance in a grove of aspen trees nearly a mile from the mine, where the battle still raged. The children blinked in the sudden daylight, their faces pale but determined, as they realized they were finally free. "What now?" Mary asked. Emma looked back toward the mine, where smoke and dust were rising from what looked like a series of controlled explosions. Her father and Macoons were finishing what they'd started, bringing down Hayes's network one piece at a time. "Now we go home," she said simply. But even as she spoke the words, Emma knew that home was a concept she was still learning to define. For 5 years, home had been whatever safe place they could find for the night. For these rescued children, home would be whatever family could be found to take them in. The real question was whether any of them would ever feel truly safe again after everything they'd experienced at Hayes's hands. The journey back to civilization took 3 days of careful travel through terrain so rugged that even experienced trackers would have trouble following their trail. Emma led the group of rescued children with the confidence of someone who'd spent months learning to survive in the wilderness, while Mary proved invaluable as a second-in-command who could keep the younger ones focused and moving forward. They made camp each night in hidden valleys or abandoned cabins, sharing what little food they could gather and taking turns standing watch for any sign of pursuit. But gradually, Emma began to relax, as she realized that no one was following them. Hayes's network was finally broken, his reign of terror ended by dynamite and determination. On the 3rd day, they crested a ridge and saw the welcome sight of Billings spread out in the valley below. But between them and the town rode a small group of horsemen, moving with the purposeful advance of an official patrol. Emma's first instinct was to hide. But as the riders drew closer, she recognized the lead figure. William Crow Feather sat his horse with the authority of a man who just completed a successful military campaign, his federal marshal's badge catching the morning sunlight. Beside him rode Macoons, battered but victorious, and behind them came a group of federal marshals escorting what looked like prisoners. Emma counted at least 6 men in chains, including one figure she recognized with grim satisfaction. Hayes was alive, captured rather than killed in the mine collapse. He would stand trial for his crimes, face justice in a federal court where his political connections couldn't save him. "Father," Emma called out, waving from the ridgeline. William's head snapped up at the sound of her voice, his weathered face breaking into a smile of relief and pride as he saw his daughter leading the group of rescued children to safety. The reunion that followed was everything Emma had dreamed of during the long months of running and hiding. Her father's arms were strong and warm around her, his voice rough with emotion as he told her how proud he was of her courage. "Your mother would be amazed," he said, studying the group of children Emma had saved. She always believed that one person could make a difference, that courage was contagious. "What happens to them now?" Emma asked, gesturing toward the rescued children. "We find their families where possible," William replied. "For those who have no one left, we find good homes with people who understand what they've been through." And Hayes, federal trial in Denver. Murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, slave trading, he'll spend the rest of his life in prison. Maybe more if some of the territorial governors decide to charge him under local laws as well. Emma felt a deep satisfaction at the thought of Hayes finally facing consequences for his actions. But she also knew that justice for past crimes couldn't undo the damage that had already been done, couldn't bring back the children who died in his mines and work camps. "How many?" she asked quietly. William understood immediately what she was asking. "We found records in his office. Over the past 5 years, he placed approximately 200 children in what he called agricultural and industrial apprenticeships. We've located and freed about 60 so far. The mathematics of horror were staggering. 140 children still missing or dead, their fate recorded only in Hayes's meticulous business ledgers. Emma felt sick thinking about all the lives that might have been saved if someone had acted sooner. "It's not your fault," William said gently, reading the guilt in her expression. "You were children yourselves, victims of the same system. The blame belongs to the adults who created this situation and the ones who looked the other way while it continued." But even as her father spoke words of comfort, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she should have done more, acted sooner, found a way to expose Hayes before so many others suffered. It was Mary who provided the perspective Emma needed. The older girl had been listening to their conversation with the same intelligence she'd shown throughout their escape from the mine. "You saved us," Mary said simply. "All of us and probably hundreds of others who won't be sold now that Hayes is finished. That has to count for something." Emma looked at the faces of the children she'd led to freedom, 6 young lives that would now have a chance to grow up safe and loved instead of dying in some remote mining camp. It wasn't enough to balance the scales of Hayes's crimes, but it was a beginning. "What about us?" Tommy asked quietly. "Where do we go now?" William's expression grew tender as he looked at his son. "You come home with me, to a ranch in Wyoming territory, where you can learn to ride horses and help with the cattle. Where you can go to school and sleep in clean beds and never worry about where your next meal is coming from." The promise sounded almost too good to be true after months of running and hiding. Emma found herself afraid to believe. It worried that something would go wrong at the last minute, to snatch away their chance at happiness. But as they rode toward Billings together, father, daughter, son, and the warrior who'd protected them all, Emma began to feel something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope for the future rather than just fear of the next hour. They were going home. Finally, impossibly wonderfully, they were going home. 6 months later, Emma stood on the front porch of her father's ranch house, watching Tommy break in a young Mustang with the natural skill of someone born to work with horses. Her brother had filled out considerably since their rescue, his face losing the gaunt desperation that had marked their time as fugitives. He laughed now often and easily, and had even started attending the local schoolhouse, where the teacher praised his quick mind and gentle way with the younger children. The mail had brought news that morning, the final convictions in the Hayes trafficking case. The former director had been sentenced to life in federal prison, along with 17 buyers who'd purchased children for their illegal operations. The investigation had spread far beyond Montana territory, ultimately exposing similar networks in Colorado and the Dakota territory that were now being systematically dismantled. Emma smiled as she read the newspaper account of the trials, her testimony having served as the emotional cornerstone of the prosecution's case. She'd told the jury about her mother's murder, about the children who'd died in Hayes's mines, about the systematic cruelty that had been disguised as legitimate business. But more importantly, the convictions had led to real change, new federal laws protecting children, oversight of territorial adoption procedures, and a special prosecutor's office dedicated to investigating human trafficking. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. A single rider was approaching at an unhurried pace, following the main road from town. Emma shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun, trying to make out the figure's identity. As the rider drew closer, she felt her heart skip with recognition. McCoon sat his paint horse with the same quiet authority he'd always possessed, looking exactly as he had during their dangerous journey through the wilderness. The warrior had disappeared shortly after Hayes's trial, vanishing into the vast Montana landscape like smoke on the wind. He dismounted near the porch and approached with his characteristic economy of movement. The injuries from their various battles had healed completely, leaving only faint scars to mark the violence they'd survived together. "Little sister," he said in greeting, using the Lakota term of affection he'd adopted for her. "McCoons," she replied, genuinely happy to see him. "What brings you here?" The warrior's expression was serious as he handed her a folded piece of paper. "Last name on your mother's list." he said simply. Emma unfolded the paper and found herself looking at a wanted poster. The face staring back at her was distinguished and kindly, a well-dressed man with silver hair and the confident smile of someone accustomed to public attention. But the name beneath the portrait made her blood run cold. Senator Marcus Whitfield, Montana Territory. The man who'd been leading the campaign for statehood, who'd built his political reputation on protecting innocent children from savage influences. According to the intelligence McCoons had gathered, Whitfield had been one of Hayes's biggest customers, purchasing children to work his illegal mining operations, while publicly campaigning against Indian savagery and the need to protect white settlers from barbarous influences. He's still operating. McCoons continued. Uses political position to cover tracks. Has new suppliers, different routes. But methods are same, buying children, working them to death, hiding behind law. Emma felt the familiar fire building in her chest, the same righteous anger that had sustained her through their war against Hayes. The monster was dead, but his customers lived on, still profiting from stolen childhoods, while wearing masks of respectability. What evidence do we have? She asked. Your mother gathered proof before Hayes killed her. Letters, payment records, witness testimony. Hidden in place only you can reach. Where? Old schoolhouse in Billings, where she taught. Evidence hidden behind false panel in teacher's desk, place she knew you would look if you learned truth about your heritage. Emma looked toward the corral where her father was working with Tommy, both of them laughing as the Mustang tried to buck off its saddle. They'd found peace here, built a life free from the violence and terror that had defined their childhood. William would want her to leave this final battle to others, to let federal marshals handle the investigation and prosecution. But Emma knew better. Whitfield was a territorial senator with connections that reached all the way to Washington. He had money, influence, and the protection of a legal system that often valued political expediency over justice. If he was going to be brought down, it would take someone willing to fight dirty, someone who understood that sometimes justice came at the point of a gun. When do we leave? She asked. McCoons smiled, the first genuine expression of happiness she'd ever seen on his weathered face. Tomorrow at dawn. Your father will not approve. My father will understand. Emma replied. This is what our mother died for. We finish it. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner around the long wooden table William had built with his own hands, Emma made her announcement. The reaction was exactly what she'd expected: William's immediate protective refusal, Tommy's desperate desire to come along, and the quiet understanding of Mary, who'd become like a sister to them over the past months. You're 13 years old. William said, his voice carrying the authority of both father and federal marshal. You've done enough fighting for several lifetimes. Let the law handle Whitfield. The law protected Hayes for 5 years, Emma replied. The law looked the other way while children died in his mines. What makes you think it will be different with a territorial senator? Because we have proper procedures now, William argued. Federal oversight, honest judges who can't be bought, prosecutors who understand the stakes. Procedures that depend on evidence, Emma pointed out. Evidence that only I can retrieve from a location Mother specifically chose for me to find. The debate continued through dinner and into the evening. But Emma could see her father's resolve weakening. He understood the stakes as well as she did. If Whitfield escaped justice, other children would suffer. The trafficking network would rebuild under new leadership, and everything they'd sacrificed would be meaningless. Finally, as the fire burned low in the stone hearth, William made his decision. If you're going to do this, he said slowly, you don't go alone. Mary comes with you. She's proven herself reliable under pressure, and you'll need backup if things go wrong. Emma felt a surge of gratitude for both her father's trust and Mary's steady presence. The older girl had, indeed, proven herself during their escape from the mine, showing courage and quick thinking that would be invaluable in the dangerous work ahead. Someone needs to stay here, Emma said gently. To protect Tommy, to maintain the cover story that we're just a normal family living a normal life. It was Tommy who settled the matter, his young voice carrying across the room with surprising authority. Let her go, he said. Emma knows how to survive things that would break other people. She'll come back. The simple faith in those words decided the issue. William gave his reluctant blessing, along with detailed instructions about staying safe and maintaining contact. Tommy extracted promises about writing regularly, and McCoons provided tactical advice about avoiding Whitfield's private security force. The next morning, Emma and Mary rode out of the ranch yard beside McCoons, their father's rifles across their saddles and their mother's locket around Emma's neck. Behind them, William and Tommy stood on the porch, waving goodbye the family Emma had fought so hard to find and protect. The journey to Billings took 2 days of hard riding across country so rugged that even experienced trackers would have trouble following their trail. McCoons had chosen the route, carefully avoiding main roads and settlements, where they might be recognized or reported to Whitfield's extensive network of informants. The old schoolhouse sat on the outskirts of Billings, its windows boarded up and its roof sagging from years of neglect. Weeds had grown up around the foundation, and the front steps were rotted through in places. It looked like dozens of other abandoned buildings scattered across the territory, casualties of economic depression and shifting population patterns. But Emma felt a powerful sense of connection as she approached the building where her mother had taught, where Caroline Whitlock had first discovered the truth about Hayes's trafficking network and begun her doomed crusade for justice. This was where it had all started, where a young schoolteacher had decided to risk everything to save children she barely knew. The interior was dusty and filled with cobwebs, but Emma could still see traces of her mother's presence. A chalk drawing on one blackboard so faded it was barely visible. A few books scattered on the floor, their pages yellowed with age. And in the corner, the teacher's desk where Caroline had hidden her most dangerous secrets. Emma found the false panel exactly where McCoons had said it would be, behind the bottom drawer, held in place by a simple wooden catch that had somehow survived 5 years of abandonment. Inside was an oilcloth package, carefully wrapped and sealed against moisture and time. Her hands trembled as she opened the package and spread its contents on the dusty desktop. Letters in Whitfield's own handwriting detailing his requirements for agricultural workers and specifying ages, genders, and physical characteristics. Payment receipts showing transfers of significant sums to Hayes's accounts. And most damning of all, a photograph showing Whitfield inspecting a group of chained children at one of his mining operations. Enough to hang him, Mary observed, studying the evidence over Emma's shoulder. If we can get it to the right people, Emma replied. Whitfield has friends in the territorial courts, probably owns judges and prosecutors. We need someone with federal authority, someone beyond his reach. They spent the next hour carefully documenting everything, making copies of the most crucial pieces of evidence, in case the originals were lost or destroyed. Emma felt her mother's presence strongly in that dusty classroom, as if Caroline's spirit was guiding her hands as she prepared to finish the work that had cost her life. It was while they were packing up the evidence that Emma heard the sound of horses outside. Multiple riders moving with the careful precision of men who knew they were approaching danger. Through a crack in the boarded windows, she could see at least 10 men positioning themselves around the schoolhouse. The Whitfield's men, McCoons said grimly, checking his weapons. Emma recognized the tactical situation immediately. They were trapped in a building with limited exits, facing superior numbers, with no hope of escape. It was exactly the kind of scenario that had gotten them in trouble before. But this time, there would be no federal marshals or Lakota war parties coming to their rescue. But as the men outside began calling for their surrender, Emma realized something that filled her with cold determination. These weren't just hired killers. They were the same kind of men who'd worked for Hayes, who'd profited from the suffering of children, who'd turned murder and slavery into a business model. "Senator Whitfield knows you're here," one of them called out. "Surrender the stolen property, and he might let you live." Stolen property. As if her mother's evidence of his crimes belonged to him rather than to the children he'd destroyed. Emma checked her rifle and moved to a window that offered a clear field of fire. Beside her, Mary was positioning her own weapon with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned to fight for survival. McCoons had taken a position that covered the rear entrance, his face set in the expression of a man who'd made peace with dying if necessary. "How many?" Emma asked. 10, maybe 12. Good positions, professional spacing. They know what they're doing." Emma nodded, feeling the same cold focus that had carried her through every previous battle. She wasn't a 13-year-old girl anymore. She was a warrior in her own right, tempered by fire and loss, and the absolute certainty that some things were worth dying for. The battle for the schoolhouse began with Emma's first shot taking down the man who'd been calling for their surrender. What followed was a desperate running fight, as Whitfield's men tried to storm the building while Emma, Mary, and McCoons held them off from inside. But this time, Emma wasn't just trying to survive. She was buying time for something more important. During her reconnaissance of the area, she'd spotted a weakness in their enemy's plan. The schoolhouse sat on a hill overlooking the main road to Billings, and that road carried regular traffic, including federal mail coaches. As the gunfight raged around her, Emma kept one eye on the horizon. And finally, just as their ammunition was running low, she saw what she'd been waiting for, a dust cloud on the road below, moving fast toward town. Emma pulled out a mirror she'd been carrying and began flashing signals toward the approaching coach using the heliograph code her father had taught her. The message was simple but urgent. Federal assistance required. Armed assault in progress. The response came immediately. The coach changed course and began climbing the hill toward the schoolhouse, its driver whipping the horses to greater speed. As it drew closer, Emma could see the Federal Eagle painted on its side and the armed guards riding shotgun. Whitfield's men saw it too, and their attack suddenly lost coordination as they realized they were about to face federal intervention. Several of them began withdrawing toward their horses, unwilling to explain their presence to federal officers. The mail coach reached the schoolhouse just as the last of Whitfield's men disappeared over the ridge. Emma emerged from the building with her hands visible, Mary and McCoons beside her, all of them battered but victorious. The federal courier who stepped down from the coach was a man Emma recognized, Deputy Marshal Crawford, the same officer who'd helped resolve their custody situation after Hayes's death. "Miss Whitlock," he said, tipping his hat. "You seem to have a talent for finding trouble. Or trouble has a talent for finding me," Emma replied. Then more seriously, "I have evidence of federal crimes, Marshal. Territorial Senator Whitfield has been buying children from trafficking networks, using them as slave labor in illegal mining operations." Crawford's expression grew grim as Emma handed over the package of evidence. He studied the documents in silence, his face growing darker with each revelation. "This is enough to end his career," he said finally. "Probably enough to send him to federal prison for the rest of his life." "Good," Emma said simply. The trial of Senator Marcus Whitfield became the sensation of the territory, drawing newspaper reporters from as far away as San Francisco and New York. Emma's testimony served as the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Her calm recounting of the evidence devastating Whitfield's attempts to claim innocence. The senator's conviction on charges of conspiracy, human trafficking, and murder sent shockwaves through the territorial government, leading to investigations that uncovered layers of corruption extending all the way to the governor's office. Several other officials were arrested, and the entire territorial adoption system was placed under federal oversight. But more importantly, the conviction led to the rescue of 43 more children from Whitfield's mining operations, bringing the total number of Hayes Network survivors to over 100. Each rescue felt like a small victory against the forces of greed and cruelty that had stolen so many young lives. Emma walked out of the federal courthouse in Helena into the bright Montana sunshine where her family was waiting. William stood beside their wagon, his marshal's badge glinting on his coat, he'd been promoted to territorial marshal in recognition of his role in exposing the trafficking networks. Tommy sat on the wagon seat now, 11 years old and tall for his age, his face bright with pride in his sister's courage. And Mary perched beside him, officially adopted into their family and grinning at Emma's approach. "Ready to go home?" William asked. Emma nodded, but as they prepared to leave Helena, she noticed a familiar figure standing in the shadow of a building across the street. McCoon's looked exactly the same, as always weathered alert, ready for whatever trouble the world might throw at him. Their eyes met across the busy street, and the warrior raised one hand in a brief salute. Then he reached into his pack and pulled out something that made Emma's breath catch, a knife in a beaded sheath, its handle carved with symbols that told the story of their shared battles. He tossed the weapon gently across the space between them, and Emma caught it with hands that had learned to grip steel with deadly purpose. The gift was both practical and symbolic, a warrior's weapon for someone who'd proven herself worthy of the title. Then McCoon's turned and disappeared into the crowd, vanishing like smoke on the wind. Emma smiled as she secured the knife to her belt. The warrior was still hunting, still fighting his war against those who profited from suffering. But now he had allies in that fight, federal marshals who understood the stakes, tribal leaders who'd been given legal standing to protect their people, and a new generation of children who'd learned that justice was worth fighting for. As their wagon rolled out of Helena toward home, Emma looked back one last time at the courthouse where Whitfield had been sentenced. On the steps, a small bronze plaque caught the sunlight, its inscription simple but powerful. "In memory of Caroline Whitlock and all the children who died fighting for justice. Their sacrifice was not in vain." Emma touched her mother's locket and settled back in the wagon seat. The long war was finally over. The network that had destroyed so many lives was broken beyond repair. She was 13 now, no longer the terrified 12-year-old who'd hidden in that burning warehouse what felt like a lifetime ago. She was Emma Whitlock, daughter of Carolyn, and William's sister to Tommy and Mary, survivor and warrior, and living proof that love could triumph over hatred. But most importantly, she was free to grow up safe, and loved, free to become whatever she chose to be. Free from the fear that had shadowed her childhood like a constant storm. The wagon carried them home across the rolling hills of Montana Territory, where a ranch house waited with warm fires and clean beds and the promise of peaceful tomorrows. Behind them, the courthouse bells chimed the hour, marking not just the passage of time, but the end of an era of suffering and the beginning of something infinitely better. Emma closed her eyes and let the wagon's gentle motion rock her toward sleep. For the first time in years, she felt completely safe, completely at peace. The nightmares that had haunted her childhood were finally laid to rest, replaced by dreams of a future where children could grow up protected and loved. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song to the Montana sky, and Emma smiled as she recognized the tune. It was the same song her mother used to hum while grading papers in that long-ago schoolhouse, back when the world seemed simpler and justice felt like something that only existed in fairy tales. But Emma had learned that justice was real. It just required brave people willing to fight for it, no matter the cost. And as long as such people existed, as long as love proved stronger than hatred, the future would always hold hope. The wagon rolled on toward home, carrying its precious cargo through the gathering twilight. Somewhere in the vast Montana wilderness, McCoon's continued his eternal hunt for those who preyed on the innocent. In Helena, federal prosecutors worked late into the night building cases against the remnants of Whitfield's network. And in a dozen states and territories, children slept safely in their beds, protected by laws written in the blood of those who'd refused to let evil triumph. Emma Whitlock had found her family, claimed her heritage, and finished her mother's work. The story that had begun with 2 starving children hiding in a burning warehouse had ended with justice served and futures secured. It was enough. It was finally completely enough.